Hello, and welcome to Monitoring and Reporting ESG Data in the Public Sector. My name is Michelle Kyle. I'm a Senior Solution Consultant specifically for the ESG offerings on the ServiceNow platform. And I'm so glad that you joined us here today to learn about this ever important and ever growing area when it comes to government and public sector addressing these issues. Now, before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to review. All the lines on today's call have been muted to prevent any background noise. However, if you have any questions during the presentation, I would encourage you to use the Zoom chat feature. We will have a short session of Q&A at the end to address any of those questions that have been presented. Today's presentation is scheduled for 60 minutes. I'm going to start with a few slides to kind of set the stage before going into the demo. And as I mentioned, I'll leave time at the end for Q&A. So we've recently published a white paper on the 4 key risks facing governments today. You'll see those on the screen here. Combating cyber threats, we've been seeing those elements in the news over and over again. Addressing climate change, securing supply chains, and responsibly adopting artificial intelligence governance. And we all have heard and read and talked about many of these elements. And believe it or not, ServiceNow is well suited to help governments and their various agencies address all of these. Now, I'm here to talk specifically about addressing the climate change issue. And I'll touch briefly on securing supply chains as well, as a growing part of ESG initiatives is really understanding how your supply chain is performing in this area. Are they monitoring ESG metrics? Are they making their best effort at minimizing emissions or ensuring their workforce is safe, as well as the communities that they are operating in? As many of you know, a majority of almost any organization's emissions comes from their supply chain. So tackling that is a very important element, and one that's been outlined here as a big risk for governments. Now, for years, there have been multilateral agreements focused on addressing the threat of climate change globally. In fact, governments have been coming together annually at events like COP, or the Conference of Parties. COP 28 was held just last year at the end fall of 23. They're getting together to work together to mitigate this risk because it is a global issue. But governments have some unique things to take into account. First of all, governments both set and report on standards. So they're doing research to ensure that the standards that are being set are really addressing the appropriate elements. But then they are also leaning into those standards and reporting against those as well. Governments in general are naturally more aligned with the UN SDGs as opposed to other voluntary frameworks that we often see the private sector align with. These take into account a broader focus and impact on the impact to the people and the economy of that government's jurisdiction. Governments are held accountable as well to other major UN agreements, like the Paris Agreement that we'll talk a little bit more about, and hence COP that meets every year. This past year, in fact, marked the first time that the COP took into account the global stocktake, where all parties evaluated where each was in tracking toward their commitments that they've made. And the result, as we understand and has been published in a variety of different reference materials, the Paris Agreement targets are at risk. So what do we do? What should be done? Recommendations for governments include adopting best practice processes and a technical or a technology framework that allows them to set goals, execute initiatives that support those goals, and properly identify and manage risk, all the while being able to measure and report on those results. And here at ServiceNow, we feel that our ESG offering will help the public sector do just that and potentially even more. So, that old adage that we've heard over and over again, you cannot improve what you do not measure, is never more true than now. You need to have that data to back up the claims that you are making, or to back up the ability to show that you are indeed making improvements or tracking toward those goals and commitments that you've put in place. And that's true whether you are a government, a public sector element, or in private industry. Those elements all remain true. Now, for ESG in ServiceNow, on the ServiceNow platform, we're really designed to help all elements of really executing a full and robust ESG strategy across a board. So that would include executing that strategy, identifying it and communicating it properly. It would certainly include ESG reporting and disclosure. So collecting the data necessary to show improvements or lack of improvements, lack of progress toward those goals that have been put in place. And then preparing that data and ensuring that it is ready for disclosure. That lends itself to auditability and the ability to have third-party assurers come in and monitor this data as well. So collecting everything that's necessary to ensure that the data is provable and auditable. Certainly, net zero is a huge component, and those net zero goals have been put in place. So we do have the ability to help monitor net zero goals and monitor your emissions, whether those are scopes 1, 2, or 3 emissions. All scopes can be managed in the tool, and we're helping identify those elements and make that much easier and automated in a lot of areas where possible, that we can help monitor net zero goals. Compliance and risk, whether that is compliance to those UN SDGs, those targets that have been put in place by the UN, or additional goals that each individual government might have set, being able to monitor those elements for compliance as you put policies into place to ensure compliance to those standards that have been set. And certainly risk management, being able to identify various risks related to climate, and certainly it could be broader than that, but we're focused on more of the climate discussion today. ServiceNow also brings to the table some sustainable IT focus, because for many organizations, governments, public sector included, IT divisions often have a very large impact on a carbon footprint. So being able to monitor that in the same way that you're monitoring any of your emissions is something that we're bringing to the table. And much like we see in the private sector, we see this maturity journey in government and public sectors as well. Certainly, as you look globally, some governments are much farther along in that maturity journey than others globally. So we see people drive through this maturity journey on their way to a fully integrated capacity of really taking in ESG, looking at all elements of the decisions that are being made with an ESG lens. How is this impacting the climate? How is it impacting the environment? How indeed then will it impact the economy and the people of these governments? So we see the same kind of trajectory where people just begin starting to collect data, then they kind of align to certain frameworks, whether those are developed by their own governments or by multilateral components like the UN SDGs. They can drive more toward governed component where they're very structured on identifying topics that are material to an organization, setting goals, executing initiatives, really addressing risk, identifying and enforcing policies, and enforcing compliance to those elements. Then to that fully integrated where everything is ESG processes are embedded into every decision that's made. Same trajectory that we see, and we feel that we can meet an organization wherever they are. We can start people with just ad hoc, or we can really drive them through all the way to that integrated capacity that we are really driving for toward a maturity journey. All right, just one more slide to talk a little bit about what we can bring to the table from a content perspective. Again, from that maturity journey, if you are just getting started, we've got various frameworks and even regulations, regulatory content that is available in the tool to help you get started and understand what reporting requirements are necessary. We'll continue to build on these. Today, we're really going to focus on the UN SDGs, but we also have some voluntary frameworks that folks have aligned with TCFD, SASB, GRI, and even some of the regulations that are coming on board. Specifically here, you see CSRD, which is coming out of the EU. I mentioned that we help people monitor their emissions by actually calculating emissions in the tool, collecting the activity data necessary in order to calculate those emissions. We have over 2,300 emission factors built into the system. You'll see those outlined here. We're continuing to grow these as necessary. Certainly, this doesn't mean that these are the only emission factors that you can use. We can bring in other emission factor data sets. You've got the capability of customizing emission factors, whether those are supplier-specific emission factors or market-specific. So a lot of flexibility there when it comes to those emission factors that we're bringing to the table. All right, let's jump in to the platform itself. I'm going to start on a dashboard. I often like to start with the end in mind. We're speaking primarily about climate today, so that's what my focus will be on. You see here that if we have data in the tool, we can visualize that data in a variety of different ways, bar charts, pie charts, whatever the case may be, all with the out-of-the-box reporting capabilities on ServiceNow as a whole. I'm looking here at Scope 2 indirect emissions for various locations or facilities. The way this demo system is set up is these happen to be facilities. I might want to slice and dice the data a little bit differently. Maybe I want to look at it from a country basis where I can quickly change view and look at things, my emissions from South Africa, from Ireland, from Germany. So those capabilities to slice and dice the data in the means that are necessary is something that we bring to the table. You're looking at waste information here, water usage, so true environmentally focused data points. You can always drill into these reports and see the data directly behind them very easily, so everyone knows where this data is coming from. As we looked at more of those environmental metrics, I do want to make the point, even though we're talking specifically about governments and their focus or their key risk on addressing climate change, there are other elements when it comes to ESG reporting that are often reported against as well, not just your environmental. ServiceNow is well suited to capture all of your ESG data, the social and the governance as well, things like your donations, your volunteer hours, if that's something that you are monitoring and measuring, safety metrics for some some agencies, government agencies that where safety is material. You might want to capture data on those. Diversity information, which is a focus around ESG, that's typically pulled over from a human resources system. So being able to automate a lot of this data collection is something that we'll focus on and talk about in just a moment. But even being able to monitor investments, if that is something that an organization or an agency is doing. Are they investing in green bonds? Are they investing in sustainable investment? Being able to track all of that. So there's very little limitation to the type of data that you're going to collect or be able to collect, even more narrative or qualitative responses when you need to get away from just the quantitative, we can manage those as well. We do have an ESG workspace where all of the work can be done in one particular location where you're able to document material topics, create goals, create a disclosure if you need to disclose this data, whether it is a report or an alignment with a particular framework like your UN SDGs. All of that can be done here in one particular location. Because I just mentioned the UN SDGs, I want to focus a little bit on our content accelerator. This is content that we're bringing out of the box to help organizations stay aligned or continue to be aligned with the frameworks or the upcoming regulations that might be necessary. So here I'm going to dive into the UN SDGs. You can see each of these have these citations. Think of these as requirements where I can take a look at what target 1.1 is for the UN Sustainable Development Goals, where we're eradicating extreme poverty for all people everywhere. And you'll see that there's more than 186 different requirements aligned with the UN SDGs. So if I just click on a handful of these for demo purposes, you're going to see that when I click next, I am bringing out of the box, we, ServiceNow, are bringing out of the box all of what we call metric definitions, all of the data points that need to be collected in order to show that you are aligning or measuring or progressing toward those targets. And again, whether these are UN SDG targets, or if they are different regulatory or voluntary frameworks, standards and frameworks that have been in place, you have the ability to kind of align with those and ensure that you're collecting the appropriate data that you need to. And those are things that we're bringing out of the box for organizations to give them a great starting point to collecting this data. When we start thinking about the data, there's a couple of things that I'd like to point out. In ServiceNow, we can automate what we call metric definitions, meaning we're going to pull data from other systems. If there are source systems that that hold this data, whether that is demographic data for your workforce, which might come from an HR system, whether it is electricity usage or utility data that would come from perhaps directly from a utility provider through a partner that we might have, or if you're pulling data from a utility invoice, all of that information can be automatically pulled into the system. I'm going to look at a manual metric definition, and one that everyone, when you are thinking about climate change, something that everyone is collecting: electricity usage or electricity consumption. Utility consumption is a large part of collecting the data for your Scope 1 and your Scope 2 emissions, and even your Scope 3 emissions. For some downstream activities. But here I just want to show you the ability to collect all of this metadata of defining what it is that you are collecting as an organization. This really lends itself to the auditability of this data, as all organizations are needing or wanting to have this data assured by a third party, that an assurer or an auditor can come in and see exactly what it is that you were trying to accomplish by collecting this data. So you're describing what you're collecting. Is this quantitative or qualitative? Because as I mentioned, ServiceNow can manage both. What unit of measure are you reporting in? How often will you collect this data? Is there a data owner? And in this instance, I've said that this is going to be manually entered in. So I might give instructions to that data contributor so they know exactly what they need to contribute. And really importantly here, I've got the ability to define whether or not I want an approval process, an approval workflow established for this data. I can categorize this data. I can show that we want to minimize this particular data point as we move forward, which is all, again, lending itself to that auditability. In this situation, I'm going to collect this electricity usage, understanding all that it is that we're capturing here. I'm going to collect it at these 4 offices. This could be 40, it could be 400. It makes no difference to the system. What we are saying is that we're going to collect the same information at all of these locations. These will likely change over time, right? Offices may change, they may move. So this gives you that flexibility of still not having to define everything over and over again, but just defining where you're capturing that. I can align this data with goals that we'll set, and we'll dive into that more deeply in just a few moments. I can also align this data point or this metric definition with as many of those frameworks or regulations as necessary. There's a lot of overlap of this data as it's being collected or as it's being asked for from those various frameworks and standards. So we want you to collect the data once, but align it to as many of those requirements as necessary. Again, just streamlining that collection capability. We even have the ability to tell the system what we expect of this data, so that we here I can have a dynamic threshold, meaning I'm putting a percentage in place that I'm saying in this example that I don't expect the data to change more than 5% period over period. And if it does, we need to be made aware of that. And you'll see what that looks like in just a moment. So all of these elements are defined for the metrics that you're going to be capturing. Now, this particular metric, electricity usage, is then going to be used, those values that you're capturing here, is going to be used in a calculated metric definition for emissions for electricity. Same thing that you'll see here, all of those details that you're defining, but most importantly here, for my emission calculations, I can see the formula that's being used to calculate those emissions. Again, from an auditability standpoint, being able to see the actual formula is very important. So here I'm utilizing the values from electricity usage, and I'm multiplying it by the appropriate emission factor for purchased electricity. This happens to be coming from the GHG protocol. You'll see that I'm able, what the system will do is automatically choose the appropriate emission factor for each of these locations and run those emissions. We could spend an hour looking at that capability. So if you're interested more in learning about the emission calculation capabilities in the tool, please reach out to us so we can really spend some time to dive into that. But each of these locations will have those emissions calculated, and the system will then aggregate that up for a total electricity from CO2e from your location based. Again, you'll see you can align it with goals, you could have thresholds in place, all of the same things that we looked at, but this is leveraging that ability to calculate emissions or any kind of calculations, whether that's an intensity calculation, any kind of calculation can be built here with our very robust formula builder. So that is a bit about the structure of the data that we're collecting in the tool. I'm going to switch personas very quickly to show how a data contributor might contribute this data in the system itself. So I'm changing to Sam. Sam is unfortunately assigned every data point in this demo platform that is ever deployed in the system. So you'll see, and Sam, because it's a demo system, never does his work. So you can see that Sam looks like a slacker, but he's really not. He's just overworked and underpaid, as many in organizations are. But what Sam would be able to do, this looks very similar to a spreadsheet. Sam is used to contributing data to spreadsheets. That's how we did things for years in sustainability and in reporting of this nature. So this looks very familiar to him. He will see exactly what his instructions are, what he's supposed to be contributing. He can see where exactly he's contributing this data for. He can even see a start and end date as to where this collection process will begin. He can see his last period value as well. And here's where that becomes important. I mentioned a moment ago those thresholds that we can put in place. I said in this platform, we had said that the data wouldn't vary more than 5% period over period. When I put in my data, it is a 40% variance. So you see here now a red flag is raised, and we have a mandatory field for Sam here to explain why this data may be out of range. Maybe there was a huge heat wave. Maybe there was a massive storm where things were impacted and electricity was used more than it had been. So any kind of information that Sam can contribute, and that really eliminates that email jockeying back and forth as you're collecting data of, hey, this data doesn't look right to us. What happened here? So we can force that information to be shared during the collection process. Sam can attach documentation here, any kind of evidence. You'll see here an electricity invoice. He could see trends of the data, but most importantly here, Sam or anyone that has the right permissions can see exactly what's happened to this data point as it's in the system. This is what we're seeing. We're seeing third-party assurers coming in and saying, this data point doesn't look right to us. Who's touched it? Has anyone changed it? What's been the chain of custody? And you will see all of that here and documented directly on the record itself. Certainly, ServiceNow has a full and robust audit trail behind the scenes, but for an auditor to be able to see that directly on the record is really valuable. So Sam will contribute his data. This had an approval process aligned with it. So I'm going to switch personas again to Oliver. Oliver is more of a data administrator. He is kind of monitoring everything as it comes in. So he can see that electricity usage has been sent in for whatever criteria Oliver has to approve this data. He can come in and look to see if there's been any breaches, if there's been a variance here. He can see if there was an attachment of evidence. He could see if Sam left him any comments or anything that he needs to know about it. He can decide whether or not he's going to approve or reject this data. If he rejects it, he has to tell the data contributor exactly why he's rejecting this data so that when it goes back to the contributor, they know exactly what they need to do. They could resubmit that data, fix it, resubmit it for approval. And again, all of that is tracked on that activity record, really streamlining the collection process, not to mention that from a streamlining perspective, the system takes over those data tasks that are sent out to people like Sam and even people like Oliver that has a task to approve some data. The system will take that over, reminding people, making sure that everyone's aware if a deadline is coming up, whatever the case may be. So that really helps streamline that collection process. Oliver also, as I mentioned, has purview or has visibility into all of the data that's coming in. So he can leverage this dashboard that you're seeing here, where he can monitor how things are coming into the system, how they are summing up. He can see each of these widgets, what's overdue, what's due in the next 7 days. As he clicks on each of these, you'll see the reports below or the list below change so that he can go directly to those records and see everything that he might need to see, like such as where might be a bottleneck that we're seeing here in the system. He can start looking at information in categories, in groupings, if you will. What's all of my environmental data? What's my financial data? He could even start looking at information from his suppliers. Now, I mentioned earlier another risk that was identified for governments or public sector is securing the supply chain. ESG data and collecting data is just one part of that, and we can help leverage that capability by utilizing third-party risk management capabilities in the ServiceNow platform, where we can send out assessments to your supply chain. We just created here a very simple ESG assessment or a questionnaire that can go out where you can really ask any kind of information of your supply chain, whether that is specific information related to data that you might need for your own Scope 3 reporting, which we're going to look at more deeply in just a moment, or whether it is more around understanding how they are acting, what their sustainability drive is in their organization, whether they have related policies that you might want to understand, and they could attach those policies here. Do they have sustainability standards when it comes to their product? Do they utilize or have a supplier specific cradle to grave emission factor that you as the organization might leverage in order to do your scope 3 reporting? So any data that can be collected here in a questionnaire, you can collect and then utilize that in your own reporting. The second way that this is utilized, and again, we're seeing this greatly when it comes to securing your supply chain and understanding the risk around your supply chain, is each of these questions that you identify or that you create can have scores or weighting around them. And if they are, as they begin to answer those questions, you can develop a risk score for your supply chain and be able to evaluate those suppliers, even so much so that if they answer a question in the negative that you really need them to be answering in the positive, an issue can automatically be created. Now, these questionnaires are answered in a vendor portal, so it's outside of your ESG tool, but it's a great way to collaborate with your supply chain and make sure that any issues that are developed, you can track through to completion, even assigning actions or tasks. All of those elements are associated here. Really key element in your securing your supply chain, which again was that third risk that was identified for governments and public sector. So this is something that we can help with as well. Now, as we talked about collecting data from your suppliers that might be used in your own reporting, that really comes into play when we focus or talk about Scope 3 reporting. So here you see a Scope 3 dashboard where you might be collecting data around Scope 3 emissions, whether those, and we've focused mainly on supplier category here or spend category, but all of this information can be collected and evaluated. Again, I mentioned earlier, Scope 3 reporting is a huge component when it comes to emission reductions. A majority of an organization's across the board, whether those are private sector or public sector, a majority of their Scope 3, of their emissions themselves are aligned or in Scope 3. So coming from outside of their organization that they don't have a lot of control over. And that's a key component here. You can see here that we can look at supplier category, which we're looking at here, computers that might be computer suppliers or server suppliers. We can even look at spend category. So there's a variety of different ways that we can slice and dice this data. Your emissions here by various categories like capital goods or purchase goods and services. So all of this data, again, much of it coming from your supply chain to actually utilize data from them for your emission calculations. We even see organizations beginning to track whether or not their supply chain has set science-based targets or if they're reporting to the CDP. That's a big part of a sustainable supply chain initiative that we're seeing across organizations here. So this is something that we are bringing to the table as well to help with all of your emission calculations. And speaking of supplier categories, I mentioned earlier our ability to really focus on sustainable IT or IT carbon footprint, which you'll see here with our sustainable IT dashboard, where we've got the ability to automate the collection of emission information from your hardware assets. You can see here we can map that on a map. You define what performance is good or bad or troublesome, worrisome, maybe an amber view that you might see here. You can click in and see data from each of these areas that you might be focused on. You have the ability to look at both CO2 equivalent or and energy consumption from your hardware assets, with the thinking being once you begin monitoring and including energy consumption qualifications within your procurement or your hardware life cycle, you'll begin to start being able to make decisions to minimize that electricity consumption, maybe retiring older assets that aren't as energy efficient. You can start looking at energy consumption by your model categories so that you can start seeing information around that data. You can even see emission information. If you own your own data centers, this is something that we can track as well. But before I leave this page, I want to point out that an e-waste initiative is things that we are often seeing IT organizations take responsibility for. How much are they sending e-waste to landfill? How much might they be donating as part of their donations to the communities that they work in? What's being reused or recycled? And how are we eliminating or disposing of these elements? So those are things that we can help IT organizations track, as well as information from organizationally owned data centers, where I can start looking at what are my data centers that are consuming more energy or having a better energy mix, energy from wind, energy from nuclear sources. How might we start making decisions on the energy that we're utilizing to be able to operate these data centers? So a lot of information that we're bringing to the table there, focused specifically on IT. So if that's something that is of interest to your organization, please make sure that you reach out so that we can dive more deeply into that. I want to talk a few minutes about accelerating or setting goals, and I'm going to focus on this accelerate decarbonization as we have focused on that climate risk that we're seeing governments across the globe really starting to tackle and face. Goals is a huge, setting goals and monitoring your progress toward goals is a huge component of an ESG of ESG initiatives everywhere. So being able to set goals, and even you'll see this one as an accelerate decarbonization. It's a high arching, overarching goal. So we might want to break those goals down into various targets so that would help us stay on track, right? Of maintaining carbon neutral operations starting in 22, sourcing renewable energy beginning in 24. I can see here which entities or which parts of my organization are participating in this goal, which allows you to have more regional goals should you choose to. I can see what data points or what metrics are being used to monitor the progress of this particular goal. Most importantly here, or maybe not most, but very importantly here, and it's something that we're seeing many of our organizations who are really progressing along that maturity journey, is being able to tie any programs or projects or initiatives that you might put in place to drive progress toward this goal. So this is what we're trying to do. This is how we're going to do it. And ServiceNow brings to the table that capability to monitor, to do true project management for any of your, say, ESG related initiatives, or truly any initiative, any program, allowing you to evaluate various projects, thinking of things like your how long will these projects take? What's the total planned cost for this project? What's not only my financial ROI on this project, but what might my non-financial ROI be? What might my emission reduction be if I replace all of my truck fleet with EV trucks, or I replace all of the lighting in my facilities with LED bulbs? So these are the kinds of initiatives or programs that we're seeing organizations execute in order to get to those goals that they have reached. And this is something that we can help with, help you prioritize those, and help you to explain to your organization or external to your organization, how is it that you're going to get there? What are the projects, and when will you see progress on those? And as you continue to collect data in the tool, in the system, you might look back and realize that your employee rideshare project that you were completing, you were expecting, for an example, a 10% reduction, or let's say a 5% reduction in your emissions. As you continue to collect data, you may realize that you only are seeing about a 2% reduction. What do you need to do from here? Do you need to expand the scope of this project? Do you need to go back and look for a different project that's going to make up that difference? So all of that capability is here within ServiceNow. And again, having that ability to tie that back to the goals that you've put in place so you can truly understand how you're going to reach those goals and what you're putting in place to ensure that you reach those goals. That's something that I think many organizations are starting to do, that being able to tie it in one particular platform is a great way to be able to visualize that. You'll also see here that we bring to the table the ability to focus on risk and compliance. This data is now being looked at just like just like financial data has been viewed for years, where you want to put control frameworks into place to ensure that this data is being collected in a valid way. Attestations might need to be done against this. You might have policies that you've put in place that you want to make sure that you're maintaining compliance with. And as you're doing control testing, issues might come into play so that you want to be able to monitor and manage these issues. all of this can come together in one location, in one view here with our 360-degree view, where I can see all of the things tied together in one location. What metric definitions am I capturing to visualize or to monitor this data? What are the values of those data points that we're capturing? What targets do I have in place? What control objectives am I monitoring here? And what control compliance do I have in place? Are there policies related to this? All of this can be seen in our 360-degree view that really brings everything together from an ESG standpoint. And we're really excited for our organizations to take advantage of that. Two more things that I'll touch on before we focus on, I see a couple of questions that have come up. So before we move to our Q&A, we do have the ability to monitor material topics and align those material topics. We can visualize them here on a heat map of what's important to an organization, but we also have that ability to align the data with various goals that we have put in place. We can associate risk assessments that we'll talk about in just a moment. What goals are focused on this material topic of climate and energy? And again, risk assessing those elements are becoming really important as climate risk is involved in a lot of the regulations and the frameworks where organizations, including public sector organizations, are being asked to really focus on climate risk and opportunity. We do have the ability to issue or to conduct risk assessments, climate risk assessments. What you are looking at here are all of the risk statements that come from TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, where they have established the framework of suggestions on what you should be focused on: rising mean temperatures, increased cost of raw material, increased severity of extreme weather. So those are the elements that are climate related that many organizations are wanting to do risk assessments on, and we can manage those here in ServiceNow as well. I know I'm hitting some high level elements as we go through. You think an hour is a long time, and often it's not near enough. So the last thing that I want to point out of what ServiceNow can bring to the table from an ESG perspective is that ability to create a disclosure. I mentioned disclosing this data for us means that if you're disclosing the data in any way, whether that is creating an ESG report like you're seeing here, this is ServiceNow as an example of part of their ESG report, or whether you're aligning to a framework like UN SDGs and you want to show how you are aligning to those with a disclosure, we can support that leveraging our Office 365 integration, where we can pull data directly from the ESG management module in ServiceNow and pull it directly into any templated Word document. And I'm going to open one here for you to see, where we can truly pull data directly in from your system that you've been collecting data in. This gives you two benefits. It gives you a straight line of sight to the data that you are using in a report to where it came from. So here, and you can see I can import or link data points directly. I can link tables, I can link charts. This happens to be a table that I've brought in. I can open that link and it will take you directly to the data in the system. Again, it takes a moment for this to surface here, but you can see that chart that was built out. I can even dive in and get directly to the records that are utilized to make up this chart. So straight line of sight from the data that's being used as you collaborate within your organization to create these types of reports. We know that these reports are not at all done in a vacuum. They're done collaboratively. So the ability to have everyone comfortable with the data that's being pulled in. We can even leverage, again, like qualitative data, like certain narrative responses. We can bring those in. This also allows us, as data is being collected and continue to be collected, this becomes a very good template that next year, if you want to disclose this data, these links can be managed and they can be refreshed. Remember, you've collected the data in this tool, you've had validation, you've assured it. When it is marked as complete, it could then be ready to be utilized in any kind of report in a Word document. Now, this data or this document can be stored directly here in ServiceNow, or we do have an integration with OneDrive, so it can be stored there on OneDrive and synced with the system. The other thing that it allows us to do is it automatically pulls out every data point that you have used in that particular report. As again, since it is tied to the system, if any of this data changes by the one role that might have permission to change the data, that is flagged here. The data owners are made aware that there has been a change in this data so that you as an organization can come evaluate that change, understand whether that needs to be restated next year, whatever the case may be. So you have a clear documentation of all of the data that's been disclosed in each record or in each document or disclosure that you've created, and you see the approvals that you have here. This gives you a nice archive of all of the disclosures that you have published, that you have created, and again, that link to all of the data directly back to the system itself. All right, so just to wrap things up, what can we bring to the table? Whether you're an organization who's beginning to report to the newly established ESG regulations in CSRD or in the EU or in the SEC in the US, or if you're a public sector agency who's collecting data on behalf of your own government's commitments, ServiceNow's ESG solution can assist you with streamlining that tedious data collection process in order to provide audit-ready data for any type of disclosure, and we can help you create that disclosure itself, what we would call that last mile reporting. The solution is designed to truly augment your resources, saving time and effort, and therefore saving money as you're collecting this data that is becoming more and more important from a government standpoint of making sure that they reach their commitments, or that you reach your commitments that you have committed to across globally, to make sure that you are collecting the data that you need to ensure that you are driving in the right direction. I do see a couple of questions here that have come out. Someone's asked about new frameworks, new regulations. How will those be made available? Those are, we will continue to certainly monitor the landscape. And as things that we have in the library today, if those update, we will update and make those available in our Content Accelerator, which is a store app in ServiceNow. Organizations themselves, you will define and decide when you want to implement those, like when you want to bring those in. We would not force those down to you. Those are just made available to you so that you can make those decisions yourself. Okay. One other question here. Let's see. It's very similar with your emission factors. How are those updated and pushed down to organizations? And again, those will be part of the Content Accelerator as well. Anytime that there are changes, we will make them available to you, but each organization, particularly when it comes to emission factors, you need to decide when you want to implement those new emission factors. Emission factors have a timestamp, if you will, within the ServiceNow platform, a start date and an end date. As you bring in the updated emission factors, you will end date the old ones. Nothing is recalculated based on new emission factors. It's only calculated, new emission factors are used from the start date going forward, never recalculated, which I know has been an issue with some tools in the past. So that's something that we have mitigated and by utilizing the Content Accelerator and giving that information to you so that you all can make your own decisions. Okay, I think those are all the questions that I have seen. So this is going to wrap up our presentation. If you'd like more information on this product or our other risk offerings, you can use these links that you see here to contact us or to join the ServiceNow risk community. Also, feel free to scan these QR codes. That first one takes you to videos available on our YouTube playlist. That second QR code allows you to register for upcoming community webinars like this one. Thank you so much for your time today. I truly appreciate it and look forward to hearing from you all if you would like more information. Thanks so much.